All right, today we're jumping into something, well, something really fascinating and maybe just a little bit uncomfortable. We're going to talk about that gap between how smart someone thinks they are and how competent they actually are. So let's just get right into it.
I mean, you know you have. We all have, right? You know the type. Someone who is absolutely certain about their opinions, totally unshakable in their beliefs, even when all the facts, all the evidence are pointing in the completely opposite direction. It can be so frustrating, even baffling to deal with. But what's really interesting is there's some actual, solid psychology behind why this happens.
Now look, you've probably seen those clickbaity headlines online, 5 signs of a low IQ, or something like that. But let's be real, that's not what this is actually about. We're going to move right past that kind of snap judgment and dig into the real science of how our minds can sometimes, well, work against us.
And here is the absolute key takeaway. We are not talking about intelligence like an IQ score. Not at all. What we're really talking about is a specific mental habit, a pattern of thinking that honestly can affect anyone. And that pattern has a name. It's called cognitive rigidity.
Okay, so cognitive rigidity. What in the world does that actually mean? Let's break this down, because this idea is the foundation for everything else we're about to explore.
At its core, you can think of it as a kind of mental stuckness, It's when someone just digs their heels in and they seem unable, or maybe unwilling, to adapt their thinking when you show them new facts, new evidence, or when the situation has just clearly changed. It's like their brain is locked into one path, and they just can't see any of the others.
And this chart really lays it out perfectly. The best way to understand rigidity is to see its opposite, cognitive flexibility. So on the one hand, you've got the rigid mindset, right? It prefers routine, dismisses new information, and resists change. But on the other side, you have the flexible mindset. It adapts. It actually seeks out new info, and it learns from mistakes. It really is the fundamental difference between a closed mind and an open one.
Okay, so this brings us to a really fascinating question. If someone's thinking is so inflexible, so walled off from new ideas, why do they so often come across as being so incredibly sure of themselves? It feels like a paradox, doesn't it? It just doesn't seem to add up.
Well, that paradox, it has a name, and it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is the second key piece of our puzzle. It's the psychological engine that creates this really powerful and often really misleading illusion of competence.
This quote from one of the researchers, David Dunning, just nails it. The knowledge and intelligence that are required to be good at a task are often the same qualities needed to recognize that one is not good at that task. Let me put that another way. In short, you need to have some skill in something just to be able to realize how unskilled you are.
And this table just illustrates that paradox perfectly. Take a look at that top row. The people with low competence often have a very high opinion of their own ability. They are just way off in their self-assessment. Now contrast that with the experts at the bottom, who are pretty accurate. And what's really interesting is that people in the middle often underestimate themselves because they know enough to know just how much they still don't know.
What's happening here is what psychologists call a metacognitive blind spot. And metacognition is just a fancy way of saying thinking about your own thinking. People who are caught in the Dunning-Kruger effect, they lack that self-awareness. It's a double whammy. They aren't just unskilled, they lack the very skill required to even recognize their own lack of skill.
Okay, so let's put our two big ideas together. When you combine cognitive rigidity, that inflexible mindset, with this illusion of competence from the Dunning-Kruger effect, you start to see very specific behaviors pop up. So now we can look at those initial signs again, but not as judgments, but as predictable, logical outcomes.
And here you can see the results of that combination. The overconfidence, that comes directly from the Dunning-Kruger effect. A lack of curiosity and flat-out rejecting new evidence, that's classic cognitive rigidity. And all of this leads to blaming others, because a mind that is both rigid and overconfident can't possibly imagine that its own approach is the problem. When you see it all mapped out like this, it really starts to make sense, doesn't it?
So there you have it. It really all boils down to these two powerful concepts that drive this whole phenomenon. First, cognitive rigidity, the inflexible mindset. And second, the Dunning-Kruger effect, the self-awareness blind spot. It's a potent, self-reinforcing cocktail.
So now we get to what I think is the most important part of all of this. It is so easy to hear about this stuff and immediately start diagnosing everybody you know. Your boss, your uncle, that guy on the internet. But the real lesson here, it isn't about pointing fingers. It's about turning the lens around and pointing it at ourselves.
Because here's the honest truth. Dunning-Kruger and cognitive rigidity aren't rare conditions that only affect other people. They are cognitive biases. You can think of them like bugs in the human operating system. And that means every single one of us is susceptible to falling into this trap in some area of our lives.
So what's the antidote? How do we fight back? Well, it all comes down to something called intellectual humility. It's the simple practice of acknowledging, hey, I might be wrong about this. It's about actively looking for opinions that challenge your own, not so you can argue with them, but so you can understand them. And maybe the most powerful thing of all is getting comfortable and confident enough to just say those three little words, I don't know. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to chew on. What is one belief you hold? Could be about politics, about your job, about a person, about yourself, that you have never, ever truly and seriously questioned. Just thinking about that. Well, that's the first step toward a more flexible and a more self-aware mind.